Hello, my name is Lola Ray. I'm from Make Good Travel. Today I'm interviewing Anne Longfield, who is the Children's Commissioner of England. We're doing an interview in lockdown, so I'm here in Brighton and Anne is in London. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today. I really do appreciate it. I'm sure you're extremely busy at the moment.
I'm in West Yorkshire, actually.
What, sorry?
West Yorkshire.
Oh, West Yorkshire. Okay, so not in London then. I just wanted to ask firstly if you could introduce yourself and just explain your role as the Children's Commissioner.
So my name is Anne Longfield and I'm the Children's Commissioner for England. And this is the role that was introduced in 2005. I'm the third Children's Commissioner. It's a public appointment, it's independent of government, but it's funded by government and it's set into law. The government signs up to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and also employs a Children's Commissioner. And essentially, I'm the eyes and ears of kids in the system. So it's my job to look from a children's perspective at what government and other decision makers are doing, and then to raise any concerns or indeed any praise if things are going well, but to really highlight where children's issues are falling off the agenda. And if you can imagine, you know, as laws or budgets are made, often the needs of children are overlooked. It often veers towards adults rather than to children. And there are some places where children just fall between the gaps in the system. I talk to a lot of children to understand what children's perspective is and the lived experience. And I get two main powers that I have in my kit bag, if you like, to enable me to be able to do this work. One is that I can go, it's called the power of entry. I can go anywhere where children are living away from home and expect to be let in and talk to those children and check they're okay, talk about their well-being. And that's particularly important for children that are in some kind of secure provision, maybe in hospital or in custody or a secure children's home. And then the other part is that I've got a power to collect data. And that means I can ask for information from any public body about children, not names and addresses and the like, but actually data about children in their area of work, and they have to give it to me. So I can find out, you know, how many children have gone to an emergency during the emergency, how many children are getting school dinners free. I can ask for all of that information, and that allows me to work out what is going on, and also for me to be able to evidence where things aren't going right and what needs to change.
Wow, that's a really amazing kind of important job that is really needed. So that's fantastic to hear that there's someone really looking out for kids out there. We started up a Facebook group during lockdown called Raising Teens in Lockdown, and many of the discussions that have been happening is whether lockdown is having a detrimental effect on young people's mental health and on their own mental health as parents as well. What are your findings on these issues?
Well, I've talked to a few young people about this, and first of all, obviously, it's a big shock to all of us. I think the last 3 months have been a huge shock. We all thought that, you know, life was going to continue roughly as it is forever. We couldn't imagine anything that would stop that. And suddenly, something so drastic has happened that meant that we've all gone into our houses and closed the doors, and only those key workers that are absolutely essential are working. And everyone, of course, appreciates that and understands and recognises, I hope, how important that is a bit more now. So we've all had this huge shock, but for children, well, I think, you know, what they've seen is all the routine of being in school and having their friends around them and having other adults around them has just gone overnight. For young people in particular, they will be worried not only about their own health, but about the health of their relatives. They'll be worried about their relationships with their peers, but also a lot tell me that they're worried about their schoolwork and what's going to happen in school. Are they going to be able to continue their studies properly? What will that mean for their futures? And for children who already had difficult mental health conditions, then I think this has been sometimes a trauma that's exacerbated that and made it worse. But I think for all young people, it's this sense of, well, you know, I thought I knew where I was in the world, but actually where's all this going to go? When is it going to end? And will life ever be the same again? So the upshot of that, I think, is what we found out, and this is partly by asking questions, is that actually there's been quite a drop-off in young people asking for help, partly because they're not seeing teachers as much or GPs and the like, the people they used to ask. But as a result of that, there's a lot of young people who aren't getting help because of the anxiety they're feeling during the crisis. So that's something that really needs to be changed. So when kids start coming back into school, I think it's really important that well-being is really at the heart of the agenda, and actually these mental health counsellors in schools to be able to help them work out what's going on and process that and come to terms with that and start their own recovery towards normality.
I think that's a really, really good idea, because this could be quite a traumatic experience in some sense for some young people, and missing that human contact as well is such a huge thing for young people, and it can cause such a knock-on effect with people's mental health, just being inside and being alone. So yeah, it is really important that we do address that. Yeah, and really address it when we are coming out of isolation, that we do need to look after our own well-being. So why do you think children should be going back to school as soon as possible during this pandemic? What's the reasoning behind it?
Well, I suppose it's two parts, three even. First of all, normality for kids is being in school. And for all the reasons where we've talked about, anxiety and difficulty with mental health, a slice of normality, I think, is going to be quite helpful with that. I know that a lot of parents are worried about their kids' well-being and mental health. They know they're missing their friends. They know they're missing out on that interaction. And it's so easy for them to start feeling anxious about their friendships, anxious about being able to have those friends in the future. So a lot of parents are saying they want their kids to get back into school. I too want children to be able to get that normality. I'm particularly worried about kids who are disadvantaged in terms of their education. Maybe they started at the beginning of this emergency, they were already struggling to keep up and already behind in some of their schoolwork, which we know a lot of disadvantaged kids are. A lot of kids just don't have access to the internet or a tablet to do her work at home. We know that actually 60,000 children don't have access to broadband, and a huge 700,000 don't have access to a tablet of their own or a laptop. There might be one in the house, but others demand that too. So that means they're not going to be able to take part in all the kind of online resources that are there, which are great, but you do need to be able to get online to get them. And that means, I think, if they don't go to school before September, that's going to be a huge 6 months out of school. But then there's also this group who, again, were vulnerable before the crisis hit. Often there's things going on at home, quite fragile home environments. There might be violence in the home or addiction or poor mental health in itself. And for those kids, when they're in isolation at home, that's a very challenging home environment for them to be in. So what we know is usually it's school that offers that kind of balance to that safe and secure place to be. And they just don't have that at the moment. So for all of those kids that really need school to keep up and get ahead and offer that really important social support to, especially for vulnerable kids, I'd like them to be in school. Now, obviously, schools have to be safe. They have to be safe places for kids, safe places for teachers and for adults too. They have to be able to be practically laid out in a way that enables some kind of spacing or distancing. Often now they're looking at, taking over several classrooms or indeed even operating outdoors. So all of those things need to be in place. But what I've seen, and it's been really fascinating, and also talked to my equivalent in Netherlands, in France and in Belgium and in Sweden actually they've gone back to school, and some of them have been saying it's been remarkably straightforward. So that, I think, shows it can be done. I found it quite heartwarming seeing some of the video footage from kids in Denmark going back. And of course, at first they're a bit nervous, and you know, they're getting used to this kind of new routine. They're in little groups, they don't go near the teacher, they leave their homework out at break time so the teacher can look at it and not touch the pages. But actually, they're laughing, they're giggling, they're having fun. And that's what I think is possible. That's what I want for the kids in this country.
Of course, yeah, we obviously going back to school is going to be a really important part of this. But obviously there are still concerns around it. Do you have any concerns for the impact that it's going to have on teachers as well? Because obviously there's going to be a lot more responsibility put on their shoulders if kids do go back to school and we do have this safe school system in place.
Sure. Well, the model that most of the schools that I've seen and the guidance is looking at, and indeed in other countries, is much smaller class sizes. Yeah. So half class sizes, so groups of 15, if you like. So that does mean you need more staff and more space. So of course that needs to be sorted out. But I think that, you know, the teachers that I've seen and that I've heard talk about this, once they've got that confidence in that system, and indeed for the parents, once they have the confidence in that system, then it's something that they can work with. And obviously they're the ones with the immense skills to be able to work with kids, reassure them, and make sure that they're learning and feeling comfortable. So I do absolutely recognise the importance of, you know, and the burden on teachers in this, but they're so essential. They are so essential to these children's lives. So I want them to get as much support as possible. I mean, I would like there to be, you know, regional teams working with teachers specifically about the school buildings. And that's something that I'm going to be asking government to look at in more detail. There are already regional teams there, but I would love them to be out visiting schools, talking about how schools can be laid out, and also councils sharing their kind of, you know, their skills of their architects and their planners in their own organisation. All of these, really, all hands on deck are needed.
Brilliant. Yeah, it sounds fantastic doing all of that. And do you think we'd be able to get this going by the 1st of June? Do you think that's a realistic goal?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's out of my hands. You
know.
I know some schools have, you know, already written to parents and say they are opening that week. Yeah. They've set out how that will be and say, you know, we look forward to welcoming one of you as parents on the return. So some will just be able to do that. Others may take a week or 2 weeks. The Association of Directors of Children's Services think it's very possible, but they think it will take a couple more weeks. I certainly think for those children, those parents who are a bit more nervous, then they will want to see how it goes that first week or two. And certainly if either the child or parent or grandparent even has particular health issues, they probably won't want to send their children in as eagerly during this term. But this term is all about, you know, putting a toe in the water. It's voluntary. Parents aren't going to be penalised for not sending their children. It's to get children back in and for normality to start before the summer holidays and before September.
Of course, yeah, definitely. It's important to get back to the normality of life, isn't it? But a lot of our parents that we have on our Facebook group are showing concerns about the safety of their kids. And I just wanted to ask, as a parent yourself, would you feel comfortable sending your kids back to school at this point?
Well, I hope I would. My child's a bit older now, in his 20s, so you know, I've got an 8-year-old nephew that lives very near to me. I see him a lot. His dad, my brother, you know, it feels a bit nervous. You know, everyone's been very close and during this period, and actually reintroducing children back to the outside world is going to be difficult. He knows my nephew's really missing his friends and starting to really feel that, and there's been a couple of difficult weeks where he knows that anxiety has been there. So whether it's the 1st of June or whether it's the 8th of June, then or even beyond that, I think the reassurance of seeing what is actually there and being set up will help. The reassurance of talking to teachers who actually work very hard on getting it going, I think that is all will all help. But ultimately, parents themselves have got to decide, because you know your child's kind of needs, and you know, everyone will respect that.
Brilliant to hear that. And many children will be thinking about school at the moment and about how it is affecting their education. I've spoken to a lot of people whose GCSEs have been cancelled, who A-levels have been cancelled. So I wanted to talk about the kids that are in the middle of their GCSEs and A-levels at the moment. What advice would you give to those young people who are kind of at a point where it is very unsure what's going on, and they are trying to revise for their exams?
Well, I think that it's really important to have contact with the school. So we know there's a huge variation. There are some schools where they're doing full programs, you know, 9 till 3 all day long on Teams with teachers. And there are others where there's been no contact with the school at all. So I think it's really important to be in contact with the school, to ask for some seminars, some online online seminars with teachers, which are the things that you would have normally in school about getting ready for exams, planning for the future, looking at choices. Those are things which usually the summer term is absolutely packed with for that group of kids in transition, but it's not there this year. So I think there should ask schools to put some of that in place, but do it virtually. And as well from you know, kids that are in year 6 actually going up to the big school as well. That's going to be really important. But apart from that, I think keeping in touch with peers, trying to get onto support groups, trying to get onto as much guidance as you can online about being able to structure your day and having good content. And really, again, I guess asking the school to help with that. This is a new way of learning for all of us, really. We're having to get used to tech, we're having to get used to content in a different way, and actually to be able to help children and young people actually manage that process is really important. So I would say, yeah, ask schools for some help on that, and I would hope they would get a positive response.
Yeah, that's so far what we've been seeing with a lot of young people. They are getting the support from schools, they just got to ask for it. A lot of children are growing up in vulnerable situations, such as living in poverty in the care system, or having special needs, or are struggling with their mental health. And I wanted to ask, what plans do you think should be in place to support these children during and beyond lockdown?
So I think, you know, I've spent a lot of my time as Children's Commissioner. The thing is, it's a set term. My time as Children's Commissioner is 6 years. So this is actually my 6th year. So
Oh, wow.
the main thing I've done really throughout my whole term is, I hope, shine a light on those vulnerable kids. I really felt that they were so overlooked, often hidden from view, often invisible, if you like, to the services. They're the children who, you know, fell through the gaps, got excluded from school, were insecure accommodation, you know, the ones that actually were having problems, and in a way the system couldn't cope with the kids rather than the kids couldn't cope with the system. So I've really put a lot of emphasis onto collecting data on that. Every year I do a report of vulnerability, childhood vulnerability, talking about the nature and the scale of those vulnerable groups. And I do think that the emergency we're still in has really exposed the fragility of a lot of their situations. The levels of poverty are enormous in this country, especially when you look at the wealth of the country. And we know that that's going to increase because 1.5 million people have applied for universal credit in the first few weeks alone. And we know that with that comes a whole kind of second tier of kind of secondary issues. We know that those families are mostly likely to be in insecure employment. We know they're likely to be in insecure and often costly accommodation. The number of children living in rented accommodation is about 3 million, about a quarter, but we know that's really weighted towards poorer families. So there's huge challenges for kids who are growing up in households where there are already so many kind of inset disadvantages there, and including those children where there's vulnerable parents there, vulnerable family situations. So what I want government to do is, rather than constantly being surprised when they hit the headlines, which you do get the feeling that is the case sometimes, to actually look. And if you look and you step out with a will to not only find those kids, but also give those kids the support they need to reduce those risks and get over those challenges, or even prevent those challenges happening, then I truly believe that it's possible. So we've put in place a whole load of data on every area that says how many children, vulnerable children there are in that area, what vulnerabilities they are. We want government to be constantly, nationally and locally, you know, feeding that in with live reports. How many turning up at A&E? How many have mental health conditions? How many families are applying for universal credit? But then have a really strong package of support in place for children and for parents. And during this lockdown, yes, but really going forward, what I really want to see is a vulnerable children and family kind of recovery program. You know, we all look back at kind of great traumatic times in our history, you know, wartime and depression time and the like. And that rebuild program is what sets the country back on its feet. Well, I think we can only do that by setting vulnerable children and their families back on their feet first. So that's what I'm going to be arguing for over coming weeks, and already are.
Brilliant. That's so essential to all vulnerable children and their parents who need that support, and they are people who are struggling the most. Do you feel like early prevention for young people is important? Is there a way that we could introduce more prevention instead of having recovery?
Yeah, so I think that has absolutely, the heart of the recovery has to be preventing more trauma. So from the get-go, from the birth of that child, you know what the vulnerabilities are. If you know, if the parents already are known to have severe mental health conditions and an addiction to alcohol, then that child is going to be particularly vulnerable. And that, of course, is known, and there'll be some initial services, but then it kind of drops off and often get lost. And it gets picked up in school when things go wrong in school, or, you know, there's difficult behaviour or there's exclusions. And then that happens. And then it only gets picked up again if something worse happens. So this kind of, you know, this kind of dreadful kind of ladder of things getting worse, and no one using each one of those points as a trigger to say, look, actually help is needed. So we know that lots of children start school way behind on their development stages at that stage, not having the speech and language they need to be able to go into school. Well, actually, a quick assessment at that point that knows that can ensure that they get that speech and language support, can ensure that they get extra support to give them that boost into school. Because if they don't get that, then it's only going to get worse as they go on, and things are just going to progress and become cumulatively more difficult. So on any ground, it's absolutely essential that we look for those kids that need help, and we make sure that from the first days that help is there and it sticks with them over time. When kids are excluded from school, obviously things aren't going well if that's happening. There's very little that kind of to assess that. It's not when a child gets excluded from school the first time, it's actually when they get excluded from school the second time that things really rocket into a really very bad place. Often if it's a boy, then it might involve getting in trouble with the law and the like, and all the evidence shows that. But knowing that, wouldn't it make sense that when a child gets excluded for the first time, that it's a trigger to wrap support around them, to give them that help, to prevent it happening a second time? And that kind of intelligent approach, which looks at kids in the round and actually looks at them as they go through life, is what I think is essential.
Definitely, and you've actually just touched on to my next question for you, which is about kids being excluded, because we do work with a lot of children that have been excluded more than once from school. And you've pretty much answered the question, what support do we need to show kids that have been excluded? And it is so important that when that happens, something is changing. It's a cry for help, isn't it?
If you look at which children are excluded from where, there's two kind of parts of it. One of it is about the kind of characteristics of the child, and often there's special educational needs, often there's mental health difficulties, often there's you know, with fragility in the family, there's troubles at home. And then if you look at the school, it's not all schools. About 85% of exclusions take place in 10% of schools.
Wow.
So actually, you could have all those characteristics in one of the other 90% of schools and not be excluded. But actually, if you're in one of those schools, then you might be. So there's those two things put together. So I really want to bring exclusions down. I want schools to have a kind of positive inclusion policy. I want them to be looking at when children need support and really providing that. If there is an exclusion, I want that to be a trigger, as I was just saying. But if there is a reason why, you know, that child can't continue in that mainstream education, if there has to be something else, then I want them to get the best support they can. And then, if possible, be reintroduced back into the school. So when we look at alternative provision, we don't see that as much at the moment. It's not all consistently good, and a lot of kids don't come back into school. But it still costs a lot. Actually, alternative provision costs about 6 times as much as school per pupil. So we should expect it to be fantastic. We should expect it to be the best therapist, you know, the best personal tutoring, all of those things, to give those kids who are having a tough time in school the boost they need to get them back. And that's the difference I think we need to see.
If children had a better understanding of regulating their emotions, do you think we would see a shift? And if we were teaching kind of more emotional intelligence in a younger age, then we wouldn't have to see things.
So I do think that that's part of that kind of resilience for kids. And one of the things that when you look at early intervention with very young children, one of the things that actually shows can really change is that it does help you regulate. So, you know, if you get really good high quality provision when you're 2 and 3, that can help you self-regulate and it sets you up from life. But being able to self-regulate is really important, but also for teachers and others to have at their disposal not only the specialists who can help, but also have, you know, the kind of processes in place in the school, the time-out processes, you know, the places and the rooms kids can go to kind of, you know, calm down or have a quiet time and the like. All of those things are going to happen in any kind of large secondary school. And it seems that the schools that anticipate that and have that kind of ethos are better able to not only prepare some kind of trauma-informed response, but also support kids when they're in that situation. And again, you know, it shouldn't be a surprise. I would like schools, all schools, and probably I'm thinking of the 10% that are more eager to exclude. I would like them all to learn from those brilliant schools that manage to be able to support kids and not exclude them.
Yeah, and end exclusion. I think that's a really important thing for young people to feel like they are always welcome in education.
That's right.
Extremely important. Some feel that school education is mainly focused just on exam results, which does exclude children who aren't deemed academic. What are your thoughts on that? Should this pandemic help change education system to help young people who maybe aren't deemed as academic?
Well, I think what's interesting as well is as kids are, whenever that is, going back into school, then actually the schools, guidance schools, is to make sure that there's a lot of emphasis on pastoral care, a lot of emphasis on well-being. And I've always said that schools should be judged on children's well-being just as much as they are on educational achievement. And I think that's really important. I also think a lot of parents want that. That's when you choose your school. But I think this period, as children go back in school, which will be different, is an interesting moment where there is a point where actually that's given more of an emphasis and more of recognition. A lot of schools will say to me, well, if we do that, actually we'd be criticised when Ofsted come around. I think there is a chance now to move that on. Of course, we want brilliant results in education, and if testing has its part in that, then it has its part. But it's more than that. You know, you want kids to be confident in themselves. You want them to be able to, you know, think creatively and be able to kind of communicate well. Those are things which, you know, are really important. So I would like yeah, I would like a reset. I would like a much greater emphasis on well-being. I would like a much greater emphasis on individuals' capacity to, learn and think and be confident and communicate. And I think that too is what employers want, actually, and we all want in society is, society and jobs that we have are massively changeable these days, and going to be even more so after the coronavirus. So kids need to be adaptable. They need to be able to be, light of foot, confident and transferable. So those, I think, is, I think there's a moment here where actually things might move on.
Definitely. We are very resilient, I think, this generation, because we have been through quite a bit already. So it'll be really interesting to see what kind of adults come out of this. Fantastic. And if you could make one change to help young people, what would it be?
Oh, I mean, I would like, I suppose this is the big ask I have. I would like young people and kids generally to have their place at the top table, and be that the top table in government or the top table in the town hall or wherever that is, that they are actually part of that decision making, and that there is a recognition that actually, kids are 20% of our population, but they're 100% of our future. And if we fail kids, what does that mean for society of the future? Whether you think about it in terms of young people themselves or indeed of all of us, we're all going to benefit if we can give kids the opportunities they need and the springboards into adult life. So to come first.
That's fantastic. I'm so glad to hear that you say that, because obviously the work that I've been doing with Make Good Trouble, it is giving young people a voice, and it is all about making sure that we are listening to young people when they are struggling and when they do need help. So I'm really glad to hear that you want to put young people's voice and children's voices at the top with the adults, which is absolutely fantastic. And my final question is, do you have any questions for us?
Well, I'd love to know what young people thought about those last two questions, really, or broaden that one about schools. How do young people feel our society needs to change? What has the coronavirus emergency told us about the way we live our lives? I mean, generally as a society, and what needs to change? What needs to change about schools? What needs to change about the way decisions are made? What needs to change about voice? What needs to change about our environment? What would you do if you were PM?
That's a good question. I'm sure we'll get some really amazing answers from all of our young people. They'll be straight on it, and you get some funny answers as well, I can imagine. Oh, well, thank you so much for your time today.
That was
It was
great.
really amazing to
Thanks so much.
get
Let's
that
keep
insight.
it up.
Yeah, definitely.